Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Uh, Tonight, Brian Nelson will be presenting on Joseph Campbell. Um, I will be your moderator tonight. My name is Evanique. So welcome everybody. So what will happen is, first of all, we're going to ask everybody to go on mute if you're not talking to improve the sound quality. Um, So I'm going to turn it over to Brian in a minute, but for those who are fairly new, we just have a couple of rules. Basically, be respectful. Brian's going to do a presentation, and then if you have something to say in response, you can either type exclamation point in chat or raise your hand in Zoom, whichever is more comfortable for you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
Okay, let's see. Am I on the screen? Can people see me? Yeah, okay. And and hear me. If you can't, I guess you should exclamation or chat. There we go. I'm excited about this because Joseph Campbell was really one of the very first authors I encountered when I started exploring mythology, philosophy, religion. Really, I think a very wise person. And by that, I mean he has a lot of experience, a lot of insight, based not only on his experience, but based on his studies. And he's very well intended. He really means the best for all of his audience. He was a professor at Smith College for decades. He was in literature as opposed to archaeology. And because of that, most of his observations are based on, what you might call the historic period, since writing has existed, and is tied into stories that are told. And that really, I think, in some ways makes him a little unique. Some of the people
Can
who are
everyone please go on mute?
some of the people who have done mythology are more archaeologists, and because of the demands of that discipline, they have to focus on a certain location. Joseph Campbell was able to was able to explore many different regions of the world in relative depth, some of them in great depth. I think he's well known for his studies in North America and his interpretations of European and Middle Eastern mythology, but he's also one of the things he's really added, and this is true of all, I think, scholastic work since about the mid 1900s. He's focused also on the Middle East, the Far East, China, and South Asia, India. So he really has a worldwide command of these issues. I've read all of his books, some of them more than once, I'm sure even more than twice. And when I say all of them, I'm not quite sure that I can really claim that, because there's a foundation that comes out with new publications based on his lectures. So every once in a while, a new title will come out. For example, I recently read a book on goddesses, which was really very insightful. I found very interesting, but that's a compilation of lectures that he'd given over the years. So his work is still being published. It's still very well received. As you'll see when this video starts, he was very well established before this video was shown. And then this work that he did with Bill Moyers on PBS really opened him up to the general public, and he was very well received. So I'm eager to show these 6 videos. Each one lasts about an hour. We'll do one each night for a month. And they're rather freewheeling discussions. Bill Moyers himself is very well educated. He was he studied in the United States and over in England, and he came back to the States and was ordained as a Baptist minister, and then got involved in journalism. First of all, working in the White House. So he was a press secretary in the White House for a while. So he's really had a great career. I think now he's retired. But at the end of his, towards the end of his career, including this series I'm going to show, he not only was the journalist, he was the editor. He put all this material, he prepared the questions, put the material together himself, and I think it's really very well done. The interviews ran for a couple years. So happened it was a couple years before Joseph Campbell died. They all happened out in California, except for the last one, which was in the Museum of Natural History in New York, just by chance, because Bill Moyers had a few follow-up questions for Joseph. Again, it's very wide-ranging, so it's difficult to identify the topic, but a thread in this discussion is the hero's journey. And that is a meta story, or that he's identified, one that is repeated over and over again with different details, what he calls different inflections in really in cultures around the world. So it is a good choice for the first episode, but he'll touch on other topics in the other episodes. So one of the things we try to do in our discussions here, 52 Living Ideas, is try to remain more or less on topic. That's going to be very hard to do here because it's tend to be wide-ranging discussions, and I'd like you to feel free to discuss and comment on anything in any way you feel is appropriate. But at some point, I might suggest we defer to a later episode to discuss some ideas in more detail. I'll tell you the ones that are coming up. Today is the hero's adventure. The next one is the message of myth, which is very similar really to the hero's adventure, but it's a little bit broader view of mythology. Whereas this one, I think, focuses a little bit on, talks about myth in general a little bit, and the hero's adventure a lot. Hero's adventure is just one of the stories that's typical in mythology. In the next one, he'll talk about myth in general, and then some other stories and some themes that tend to appear in these different mythologies, these meta stories. The next topic is the first storytellers, and there he's going to get into the prehistoric, the Paleolithic, and early Neolithic cavemen and things that you can imply or infer from the archaeological record. The next one is a sacrifice and the bliss, which again is it's really tied into the hero's journey. It's as he'll suggest, with a lot of mythology, it tries to capture and provide guidance concerning life in general, the course of life, from birth to death. And sacrifice and bliss, I think, are some of the themes that come out as very important themes in all of these mythological tales. Then there's the next episode. The fifth is Love and the Goddess. That's a little different. He was, scholars are challenged to come up with new ideas. And one of the new areas that he studied and where he made a mark was the recognition that the idea that romantic love is an essential part or a valid part of the human experience. He recognized that as a mythical theme, in particular in the Western mythology. So not in the North American Indian or Chinese or Indian. Of course, I'm sure that people would dispute that as with other topics, but he does make a very good point that I think, a very good argument that it certainly exists in the Western mythology. And so he focuses on that particular topic. And then the other topic, and somewhat in conjunction with that in this fifth episode, is the goddesses. Much of what we talk about in this series is, I would say, unfortunately, tends to focus more on men than women. And this fifth episode is a corrective on that. And he points out that the goddess worship and the importance of goddesses was much more important in the prehistoric period. So in the Paleolithic, the Neolithic, before there was writing. And that's all evidenced, significantly evidenced in the archaeological record and in the very earliest writings. But it tends to, as the myths evolved really pretty early in the historical period, there was a shift from the emphasizing the goddess to emphasizing gods and men as opposed to women. So there is since he's focused on literature and stories in the historic period, there's a bit of a focus, I don't want to say a prejudice, but an inclination to talk about stories involving men. Having said that, you'll see already in the first video today, there's mythologies and stories involving women, even in this very first episode, and that will continue to be true throughout the 6 episodes. Finally, the last one is the Masks of Eternity, where it talks about the man or people's need for something, for a religious aspect to life, some reverence for life, and other broader topics. That these are topics that Bill Moyers wanted to bring up kind of as a postscript to the entire series, and that is also a very interesting episode. Yeah. So I've already spent really a long time. We'll see how we do now. I have the videos. I have it set up so that we'll pause at 4 different times, including at the end. So there'll be 3 interruptions where you can, or 3 times when I'll stop, when we'll have some discussion. And my idea is roughly to run it, discussions will run 20 to 30, or each section will run 20 to 30 minutes. The segment I want to show will run 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. I'm very flexible for how that runs, but at the end of the day, I'll try to keep things focused and more or less on time. And as necessary, we can defer the discussion of certain topics to later episodes. Okay, any questions or comments about that?
If anyone has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom.
Nobody? Okay.
Mark.
Thanks, Evanique, and thank you for that wonderful intro. I'm not sure if I heard you say that the order of the episodes was Bill Moyers' decision, perhaps, or do you know anything about that?
Well, I know that he originated the idea for this series. He put together all the questions. I'm sure he was involved in selecting the bits of video that would be shown. So I have no doubt that he also set together the episodes.
I guess I'm asking because I wonder if there's some meaning. Maybe we can wait till we get through them to answer this, but some logic or internal coherence to the order of the episodes.
Well, I would guess that before he put together the order of the episodes, before he finalized the order of the episodes, and probably even the videos for each episode, that he consulted and maybe even showed it to Joseph Campbell, but that I don't know. And whether there's so if there's a sense to it, yeah, Joseph Campbell might have helped to add his sense to it. But I think I've read, as I said, I've read a lot of his work, And the thing I will say is that these videos are not a systematic presentation of his thinking. It is an exploration of his thinking based on the questions that Bill Moyer is asking. And when I said that Joseph Campbell was a wise man, I could just tell by listening and having read his books, tell by listening that he's very careful in the words he selects. And there's a lot of judgment involved in selecting those words. There's a lot of meaning to him that he's trying to convey in the few words that he selects. There could be a vast mythology and a study of mythology behind a particular topic. But then the last thing I would just stress again is that it's not neatly outlined. It's more of an open discussion. There are threads to it, to each one of them, but I think you'll find in the last episode, he touches on the hero's adventure. And on this episode, he talks about female goddess quests. So it's all different topics come up, or all of the topics come up in each of the episodes. They're just a slightly different emphasis. Any other questions? Okay, then let's see if I can do this. It's a pretty exciting production on this. It's a PBS production. And if I can actually make it happen, we'll have some fun with it. All right, let's see. Is it working?
I can see it. We can't hear anything.
Oh, let me try again. All right, I'll try again. You hear trumpets?
A little, I heard it a little bit. You might have to cut the volume on YouTube up a little bit, or the video.
Someday every valley,
There you go.
All right.
every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all the earth shall see it together.
We have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path. And where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. Where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. Where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world.
Joseph Campbell on the hero's adventure. He was the teacher everyone would like to have. He was the archetype, to use one of his favorite words, the original, the ideal. One of his students at Sarah Lawrence College, where Campbell taught for almost 40 years, described him as a beaming flashlight into the darkness. The director, George Lucas, said of Campbell, if it hadn't been for him, it's possible I would still be trying to write Star Wars. When I met him late in his life, college students across the country had been reading Campbell's influential book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, for years. Scholars pored over his 4-volume study of mythology, The Mask of God. Now he was working on a monumental historical atlas of world mythology. Yet beyond the classroom and lecture halls, only a relative handful of people had ever seen Joseph Campbell in person or heard him speak. That changed with our series. As the broadcast played out over 6 consecutive weeks, the accumulating insight and wisdom had an enormous, unexpected impact. Thousands of letters poured into public television stations around the country. One that I received soon after the first broadcast from a woman in Kew Gardens, New York, summed up the collective reaction. She said, "I will never be the same." The series has been repeated over the years, and people continue to stop me in public to say simply, "Joseph Campbell changed my life." I say to all of them, yes, he was a great teacher. But exactly how and why he touched so many different lives, I can't say. But I can say this. At a time when millions of people were yearning for a way of talking about religious experience without regard to a rigid belief system, Campbell gave them the language for it. He said myths were clues to our spiritual nature, and they could help guide us to a sacred place within where we might unlock the creative power of our deeper unconscious self. And then there was the brilliant clarity he brought to the great and enduring theme of mythology across the ages, the hero's adventure. He tracked that theme in the symbols, stories, and rituals that keep appearing in different cultures, coming alive in literature, art, and religion, and today in movies, comic books, and yes, video games. Campbell believed the most heroic of all acts is the courage to discover who you are and what you would like to be, to slay the savage dragon of the ego, and to follow your bliss to the truth of your life. We taped these conversations at George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch in California over the last 2 summers of Campbell's life. Naturally, we began with his favorite subject, the hero with 1,000 faces. Why the hero with 1,000 faces?
Well, because there is a certain typical hero sequence of actions, which can be detected in stories from all over the world and from many, many periods of history. And I think it's essentially, you might say, the one deed done by many, many different people.
Why are there so many stories of the hero or of heroes in mythology?
Well, because that's what's worth writing about. I mean, even in popular novel writing, you see the main character is a hero or a heroine. That is to say, someone who has found or achieved or done something beyond the normal range of achievement and experience. A hero properly is someone who has given his life to something bigger than himself or other than himself.
So in all of these cultures, whatever the costume the hero might be wearing, what is the deed?
Well, there are 2 types of deed. One is the physical deed, the hero who has performed a war act or a physical act of heroism, saving a life. That's a hero act. Giving himself, sacrificing himself to another. And the other kind is the spiritual hero who has learned or found a mode of experiencing the supernormal range of human spiritual life, and then come back and communicated it. It's a cycle. It's a going and a return that the hero cycle represents. But this can be seen also in the simple initiation ritual, where a child has to give up his childhood and become an adult, has to die, you might say, to its infantile personality and psyche, and come back as a self-responsible adult. It's a fundamental experience that everyone has to undergo. we're in our childhood for at least 14 years, and then to get out of that posture of dependency, psychological dependency, into one of psychological self-responsibility requires a death and resurrection. And that is the basic motif of the hero journey, leaving one condition, finding the source of life to bring you forth in a richer or more mature or other condition.
So that if we happen not to be heroes in the grand sense of redeeming society, we have to take that journey ourselves spiritually, psychologically inside us.
That's right. And Otto Rank, in his wonderful, very short book called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, he says that everyone is a hero in his birth. He has undergone a tremendous transformation from a little, you might say, water creature living in a realm of the amniotic fluid and so forth, and then coming out, becoming an air-breathing mammal that ultimately will be self-standing and so forth. This is an enormous transformation, and it is a heroic act, and it's a heroic act on the mother's part to bring it about. That's the primary hero form, you might say.
Still a journey to be taken after that.
There's a big one to be taken.
And that journey is not consciously undertaken. Do heroes go out on their own initiative?
Well, there are both kinds. A very common one that appears in Celtic myths of someone who has followed the lure of a deer or animal that he has been following, and then carries him into a range of forest and landscape that he's never been in before. And then the animal will undergo a transformation and become the queen of the fairy hills or something like that. That is one of not knowing what you're doing. You suddenly find yourself in full career of an adventure. There's another one where one sets out responsibly and intentionally to perform the deed. For instance, when Ulysses' son, Telemachus, was called by Athene, go find your father. That father quest is a major hero adventure for young people. That is the adventure of finding what your career is, what your nature is, what your source is. He undertakes that intentionally. Then there's one into which you are thrown and pitched. For instance, being drafted into the army. You didn't intend it, they are in. You're in another transformation. You've undergone a death and resurrection. You put on a uniform. You're another creature.
So does the heroism have a moral objective?
The moral objective is that of saving a people or saving a person or saving an idea. He is sacrificing himself for something. That's the morality of it. Now, you, from another position, might say that something was something that should not have been realized, you know. That's judgment from another side. But it doesn't destroy the heroism of what was done. Absolutely not.
Well, that's a different angle on heroes than I got when I was reading as a young boy the story of Prometheus going after the fire and bringing it back and benefiting humanity and suffering for it.
I mean, Prometheus brings fire to mankind and consequently civilization. That's, by the way, a universal theme.
What is?
The hero, the fire theft theme usually with a relay race after it. Often it's blue jay or woodpecker or something like this that steals the fire and then passes it on to something else and something else, one animal after another. And they're burned by the fires as they're carrying it on. And that accounts for the different colorings of animals and so forth. It's a worldwide myth, the fire theft.
Do these stories of the hero vary from culture to culture?
Let's see. Oops. How do I share my video? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Do you see your share screen? That screen on the bottom?
Yeah.
Hit that again.
No, I see here. Let's see. Okay, but now it just shows my name. It has Great Heart. That's it.
You can't see the YouTube videos?
No, I can't see myself. Can you guys see me?
We can see you. Yeah, your
All right.
video's off, but we can see you.
All right. Well, that's the place I picked for the first stop. And one person, Kimberly, saying she likes it. A thumbs up. So that's great. Yeah, this was, like, as I can say, this was very meaningful to me and all of his books when it continues.
Brian, would you like to start your video?
I did.
It's off right now.
Yeah.
Know how to get it going. Oh, here it is. I got it. Okay, there. Yeah. All right. So there's so this is all very meaningful things to me, and in my further studies, it doesn't really take away at all from any things that he has said. What I'd like to do is put it open for comments from other people, and see if this had any significance or meaning to you.
So if anyone has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom.
Domi, did I say that right?
Oh yeah, it's actually Dominic. I think I have to change that, but thank you. So I don't know. Yeah, I maybe put this out as a question. I think I have some kind of answer to it, but I'd be curious what others maybe say. I don't know if someone picks up that thread or if other ideas come up. But one thing maybe to understand these topics better is, or the way of thinking that is behind Campbell's ideas. Okay, let me rephrase that. I think one major question is maybe, why should someone think of something like the ego or human psychology in terms of these narratives and stories? What is the relationship between, okay, there's this one thing, the hero's story, and how it connects to psychological, personal, subjective human matters. I mean, it goes straight into it, but I don't know if it would make sense to start the discussion to first kind of explain what's this general approach here. Why even look into these mythologies and narratives? And then there's one apparently which is particularly important and repeating in different forms and shapes. And then somehow this whole thing, this this narrative can be used to talk about something like that is the psychology of a person, like what their ego is like. It goes sort of straight into it. But for someone maybe who has never heard of Campbell or Jung, I think maybe that would help to establish the foundational ideas. Yeah, why use mythology and storytelling to tell me something as an individual, how I function? I don't know if it makes sense to first shed some light on that. I think
Hey
it would
folks, this is Kevin. Would you mind if I jumped in real quick?
No.
I may lose connection and have to drop in a few minutes, but I was going to bring something else up. That's a good question there. I don't know if it's, I don't believe that Campbell was telling us how to live, but only extrapolating from historical documentation the commonality of our collective conscious, collective subconscious, if you delve into it. So nobody's saying to you, this is how you live, what you should live. If you have curiosity about why we are wired the way we are, I think it's extremely instructive, but you'd have to get into it. The other point I wanted to make is, before I drop, there's a YouTube channel called Craigenford. I don't know if anybody here knows that, but he's got a whole portfolio of videos that go into these oldest of myths, where they were well into prehistory, and the commonality between them. So he's kind of like doing a video log today of a lot of the elements that Joseph Campbell did brilliantly on his own without all the technology on his own for decades ago. So it's called Craigenford, Creanford. And if anybody's interested, I think that's a good source for you folks too. That's it.
Yeah, I do listen to Craigenford. I enjoy it a lot. I think he gets into the period more of the prehistory before the writing. Again, Campbell, he also gets into, I forget the host's name, but Craigenford gets into literature as well and the stories, but he's also looking a lot at prehistory before writing and archaeology. And it's honestly, it is fascinating. It is fascinating.
Thanks, folks. Enjoy.
Yeah, the Indo-European background, that the similarities are come from a common origin, not just parallel experience, is, I think, one of his main themes. Very interesting.
Which is, if you think about it, the hero's journey, right? He's collecting the different mythos of different cultures and their, hero's transformation. The same kind of thing, only Craigenford does it for a lot of different journeys, if you will. The Great Hunt, where the original gods and goddess concept came from, the creation myths that vary but are very common as well. It's interesting stuff. Thank you very much. Great conversation, great review here so far.
So we will come back to Dominique's question. Let me say that Dominique's point, is it's a very important question. It is something that Joseph Campbell will talk a little bit more explicitly about later in this video. So we can touch on it, but maybe it would make sense to go into it in more depth later in the videos, because he addresses the question more squarely later on. And then again, the Craigenford, the fact that there are common origins that can be traced back through the archaeological records is also very fascinating. Craigenford does a great job with it. And that's the next topic that's going to come up here, is how the stories of the myths change or have inflections. So these meta stories are told using the surroundings that each people are living in, the surroundings of each culture, but Joseph's saying it tends to be the same story. And he also points out, and that's in this next section, that the stories change over time. So if you're in a hunter-gatherer culture, the stories are different from a farming culture, for example. And so that brings out the changes that occur over time, that I think the second person, I didn't catch his name, didn't pop up for me, but that's part of what he was alluding to. So very, very on point questions. I have something I could say about Dominique's question. Does anybody else have something to say? Well,
we have a couple people lined up. We have Bob Pan, followed by Dave, followed by Mark. So however you want to do it, Brian.
I see Dave of Tacoma's popped up first.
No, actually Bob did. He's in the chat. He typed exclamation point in the chat.
Let's do Bob.
Hi. This might be premature, but when the hero is mentioned right at the beginning, does Joseph Campbell mention the hero is somebody who stands out in a positive way? Does Joseph Campbell cover negative people like anti-heroes or villains? Will that be covered in the future?
He talks about the hero confronting the anti-hero or the villain. So
Okay.
yes, in that context, but I don't think he dwells a lot. He takes more the, I guess, the positive approach. He tries not to be very moralistic about it, but he doesn't deal with villains as a separate topic.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Up next, I have Dave, Mark, and William.
Thanks, Brian and Avanique and Shrikant. I'm really glad you dug up Joseph Campbell. I think this is about 50 years old. To me, that was a golden age. And I remember watching that live in my youth, I should say. And I forget the interviewer's name, but I think he was a Baptist minister. And, you know, that we'd all been brought up in religious stories and myths or whatever. But Joseph Campbell apparently gone all around the world and investigated and studied all this mythology from other sources, other belief systems. And it's just amazing. Oh, and Native American traditions. I think it come in some of the future episodes. And I remember we dabbled into Son of Man for a few episodes with Shrikant and I'd like to get back into again. But to me, part of this is like the hero's journey is the basis for many a story or many a movie, talking about songs or myths. But yeah, all this structure, it's interesting to study all this. Thank you very much. Great session.
Thank you. Mark?
Thanks, Brian. I also wanted to take a stab at Dominique's question, which I thought was quite interesting at the beginning as we embark upon this journey, because this is kind of like a journey for us, I suppose. And as I understand the question, Dominic, you're asking why we should assume that there is a connection between the stories that we're reading in mythology and our own psychological development. And one of the ways I think about this is, or one of the ways maybe we could think about it, is by looking at the connection between myths and dreams. And maybe this is something that Campbell's going to get into in the future. It's been about, since '88, I guess, 35 years since it really first aired. The connection between myths and dreams also goes back to stuff that Jung was writing about. And if you think about a myth, it can have things that happen in it that don't correspond with reality. So can dreams have things that can't happen in reality. They do happen in dreams. Myths come from a place that we can't really identify. Because history is so opaque, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when or how a myth began. And the same can be said about dreams. We can't really put our finger on where dreams originate from. And myths very often reveal important values that are needed. I think Jung would say that are needed by consciousness. And dreams also may be sources of important values. So if you kind of put these side by side and you see, wait a minute, there are a lot of correspondences here. That gives us a kind of prima facie reason to believe that myths are related to our own psychological development, I would say. Thanks, Brian.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. I hadn't put together myth and dream in quite that way. That's really interesting. Yeah, they're actually, Joseph Campbell in this video later is going to tell a dream from Carl Jung, tell of a dream interpretation from Carl Jung. So, and he touches on this topic. So you guys are just totally on track here. Anybody else?
I think William is next.
William.
And Katie.
Okay. William?
William, are you there?
Well, is it
Oh,
me?
hi. I don't know if you can see us.
We can. He can see
Okay.
one figure at least.
Oh, well, let's see.
Oh yeah, William, you have the bridge behind you.
Oh, you see William? Oh, okay.
Mhm.
No, I see, well, no, I don't see William.
Oh, you don't see me. Okay,
I
I'll,
don't know
I'll
where
try
our
to get
video is. We'll have
closer.
to check. We haven't joined
But
this before.
Sarika has a question for
Oh,
you
yeah,
that she would like to
video.
ask. I have one too, but I'll let Sarika speak first because her question is possibly more important.
Okay, thank you, Beth. Oh, okay, so in the video, they said that, part of the beginning of a hero's journey is like leaving their family or abandoning their childhood to have adult responsibilities and, maybe surrendering themselves to save somebody's life or to advance a certain idea. But I really haven't studied Joe Campbell much, so I'm asking just in general where this is all going in the video. But what about someone who's abandoned by their family or is exiled or shunned? Are those preconditions something that is addressed for someone who might want to have a hero's journey? Do they need to have the preconditions of being sent off in, a good way? I mean, there are lots of people like, Copernicus and all these people who, were killed for having life-changing ideas. Was that the hero's journey? I don't understand. What do you think?
Well, I would say, I mean, you're making an excellent point, and it's part of the limitations of this video series. You really can't cover everything. So he's talking about, a paradigm in this case, but no, he does not believe that that is a necessary paradigm. And there are other hero journeys. He's going to talk about Moses, for example. He doesn't mention the fact that Moses is abandoned, but he mentions Moses as a hero, and Moses was abandoned. So I think it's more generally that there are I think what he was pointing to in that the references you mentioned is the transformations that people necessarily go through in life, one way or another. And he just was emphasizing one way in which people might go through them. As an example. But that's really a good question. And it's also something that I think, again, limitations of the video format, the video interview format. He talks at the same time about this sort of cultural hero who goes out, captures a boon or some benefit for a community, for humanity, and brings it back to humanity, and they recognize it and accept it. So it's a community, it's a heroism that involves community, individual effort and community recognition. But he also talks about the type of hero that the hero journey that we all go through that doesn't involve any kind of community recognition. It is that you will go through these transformations, and the transformations will be heroic.
The transformation, do they talk more about that later on in the series?
It's that that dichotomy, if you will, is going to run through all of the videos. And I mentioned it because I don't think that's very well distinguished. There's these, what I would call these celebrity heroes, the cultural heroes like Moses and Buddha and the others who have obviously are captured in history for having done something monumental for humanity or their communities. But then it's also the fact, and I don't think this point comes out very well, at least not expressly in this very first segment. It's also the fact that we all go through similar transformations in life. We confront similar challenges. We have the same, I like to think of the challenges as opportunities, so we confront similar opportunities in life. And in some ways, they are inevitable. You will grow up, you will die. Most people need to earn a living. You know, there are these things that you will confront and you will have to deal with one way or another. And the accepting them and dealing with them is heroic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
a lot
you.
for your input. That was very helpful.
Did
You're
wanna ask
welcome.
a question? They put up for one, otherwise I have to move on.
Dominique.
Actually, Brian, we have Katie next,
Oh, okay. I'll
and
let
then Steve. And I think before we let people like ask multiple questions, do you want to just answer questions, or do you want to move on to the video after Steve?
well, let's see what these two questions, and I'll say something briefly about Dominique's. But actually the things that people have touched on are going to come up later in the video again, so we'll have a chance to revisit these points.
Okay, so then we have Katie followed by Steve. Katie, is she still here? Katie, are you here? I don't see her, so up next we'll just go to Steve.
I was going to respond to her question about being orphaned. And if you look at the superhero motif of Superman and Batman and other superheroes, you'll see that oftentimes that their parents were murdered, their planet was destroyed. So those superheroes do have loss in their early upbringing that helps them to create superpowers.
Yes, absolutely. And beyond that, I would say that part of the hero journey is, as outlined by Joseph Campbell and others, whether it's one of these a cultural hero or just a personal journey, an inevitable part is confronting the unknown, and being orphaned will plunge you into the unknown without the supports that other people might have. So the adventure begins in a different way at a really early age. Okay, let's see.
Well, actually, Katie just came back in, so
Okay.
Sorry, it's a connectivity issue. I was going to mention Moses as the hero's journey. So that kind of got covered, but he goes out and he leads people out of Egypt. But Jesus is often referred to more as like less as a hero and more as a savior. That was going to be my second question attached onto that. I'm trying to understand the difference between, because he kind of has some element of a hero, like he heals, he performs miracles, he heals the blind. But how would one differentiate the difference between a hero and a savior, or is it kind of overlapping?
Well, I'm not sure this answers your question, but one differentiation that Joseph's already referred to is the physical hero, you know, let's say, who brings back fire, contributes something to material culture, and then the spiritual hero who brings back brings an enlightenment to the world. So that's a distinction. I think Jesus would fall in the second category. But beyond, I don't think that really, answers your question entirely. Could we come back to that, because he's going to talk about Jesus and Buddha and the others a bit later. Okay. On Dominique's question, absolutely. Yes, I think I don't know that much about Carl Jung, but I think, yes, he would also, he sees dreams as, obviously dreams are stories, so he sees dreams also as important, but I think what he identifies in dreams are these are forces that tend to be prevalent or present in everyone's lives, either as archetypes or personalities. And they, so that's another aspect to, I think, Jung that hasn't really come out yet in what Joseph Campbell's been talking about. But they both, I think they both talk a lot about stories, one about myths more and the other one about dreams. But yeah, I think they really have a lot in common in this regard. But the ego is going to come up again very explicitly later in this video. So we can come back to the rest of that. That is really a key point in all of this. And it's going to, and Joseph Campbell will address it explicitly a bit later. Let's go on to the next, which is different inflections in this meta story of the hero's journey, hero quest or hero journey in different cultures and over time. And Joseph Campbell picks up in answering the question from Bill Moyers, he picks up on changes over time. And then he talks about changes, the difference. He just gives examples of the differences between those who bring the physical boon and those who bring the spiritual enlightenment. And it's based to some extent on the culture in which they're operating. So let's just see what Joseph has to say on this. All right, let's see. Try to get the question again. Here we go.
It's a worldwide myth, the fire theft.
Do these stories of the hero vary from culture to culture?
Well, it's the degree of the illumination that or action that makes him different. There is a typical early culture hero who goes around slaying monsters. Now that is in the period of history when man is shaping his world out of a wild, savage, unshaped world. Well, it has another shape, but it's not the shape for man. He goes around killing monsters.
So the hero evolves over time, like most other concepts and ideas. And
well, he evolves as the culture evolves. Yeah. Now, Moses is a hero figure. In his ascent of the mountain, his meeting with Yahweh on the summit of the mountain, and coming back with the rules for the formation of a whole new society. That's the hero act. Departure, fulfillment, return. And on the way, there are adventures that can be paralleled also in other traditions. Now, the Buddha figure is like that of Christ, of course, 500 years earlier. You could match those two traditions right down the line, even to the characters of their apostles or their monks. Christ, now there's a perfectly good hero deed formula represented there. And he undergoes 3 temptations. The economic temptation, where the devil says, "You look hungry, young man, change the stones to bread." Jesus said, "Man lives not by bread alone, but every word from the mouth of God." Next, we have the political temptation. He's taken to the top of a mountain and shown the nations of the world and says, "You can come into control of all these if you'll bow to me." And then, now you're so spiritual. Let's go up to the top of Herod's temple and see you cast yourself down, and God will bear you up, and you won't even bruise your heel. So he says, "You shall not tempt the Lord your God." Those are the 3 temptations of Christ in the desert. The Buddha also goes into the forest, has conferences with the leading gurus of the day, and goes past them. comes to the bow tree, the tree of illumination, undergoes 3 temptations. They're not the same temptations, but they are 3 temptations. And one is that of lust, another is that of fear, and another is that of social duty, doing what you're told. And then both of these men come back and they choose disciples who help them establish a new way of consciousness in terms of what they have discovered there. These are the same hero deeds. These are the spiritual hero deeds. Moses, Buddha, Christ, Muhammad literally, and we know this about him. He was a camel caravan master, but he would leave his home and go out into a little mountain cave that he found and meditate and meditate and meditate and meditate. And one day a voice says, write, and we have the Quran, you know. It's an old story.
Sometimes it seems to me that we ought to feel pity for the hero instead of admiration. So many of them have sacrificed their own needs.
They all have.
And very often what they accomplish is shattered by the inability of the followers to see.
Yeah. You come out of the forest with gold and it turns to ashes. That's another motif that occurs.
In this culture of easy religion, cheaply achieved, it seems to me we've forgotten that all 3 of the great religions teach that the trials of the hero journey are a significant part of it, that there's no reward without renunciation and without a price. The Quran speaks, do you think that you shall enter the garden of bliss without such trials as come to those who passed before you?
Well, if you realize what the real problem is, and that is of losing primarily thinking about yourself and your own self-protection, losing yourself, giving yourself to another. That's what a trial in itself, is it not? There's a big transformation of consciousness that's concerned. And what all the myths have to deal with is transformation of consciousness. That you're thinking in this way, and you have now to think in that way.
Well, how is the consciousness transformed?
By the trials.
The test that the hero
Tests
undergoes.
or certain illuminating revelations. Trials and revelations are what it's all about.
Well, who in society today is making any heroic myth at all for us? Do movies do this? Do movies create hero myth?
I don't know. Now, my experience of movies, I mean, the significant experience I had of movies was when I was a boy, and they were all really movies. They weren't talkies. They were black and white movies. And I had a hero figure who meant something to me, and he served as a kind of model for myself in my physical character, and that was Douglas Fairbanks. I wanted to be a synthesis of Douglas Fairbanks and Leonardo da Vinci. That was my idea. But those were models, were roles that came to me.
Does a movie like Star Wars fill some of that need for the spiritual adventure, for the hero?
Oh, it's perfect. It does the cycle perfectly. It's not simple morality play. It has to do with the powers of life and their inflection through the action of man. One of the wonderful things I think about this adventure into space is that the narrator, the artist, the one thinking up the story, is in a field that is not covered by our own knowledges. You know, there was much of the adventure in the old stories is where they go into regions that no one's been in before. Well, we've now conquered the planet, so there are no empty spaces for the imagination to go forth and fight its own war, you know, with powers. And that was the first thing I felt there. There's a whole new realm for the imagination to open out and live its forms.
Do you, when you look at something like Star Wars, recognize some of the themes of the hero throughout mythology?
Well, I think that George Lucas was using standard mythological figures. the old man as the advisor. Well, specifically, what he made me think of is the Japanese sword master.
Remember, a Jedi can feel the Force flowing through him.
I've known some of those people, and this man has a bit their character.
Well, there's something mythological too, isn't there, in the sense that the hero is helped by this stranger who shows up and gives him some instrument, a sword or a sheaf of light,
but
shaft of
he
light.
gives him not only a physical instrument, but a psychological commitment and a psychological center.
This time, let go your conscious self and act on instinct.
Well, he had him exercising with that strange weapon and then pulled the mask over. That's real Japanese stuff.
When I took our two sons to see it, they did the same thing the audience did at that moment when the voice of Ben Kenobi says to Luke Skywalker in the climactic moment,
"Use the Force, Luke. Let go, Luke."
The audience broke out into elation, into applause.
Well, you see, this thing communicates. It is in a language that is talking to young people today, and that's marvelous.
So the hero goes for something. He doesn't just go along for the ride. He's not a mere adventurer.
Well, a serendipitous adventure can take place also. You know what the word serendipity comes from? It comes from the Sanskrit, serendripa, the isle of silk, which was formerly the name of Ceylon. And it's a story about a family that's just rambling on its way to Ceylon, and all these adventures take place. So you can have the serendipitous adventure as well.
Is the adventurer who takes that kind of trip a hero in the mythological?
He is ready for it. This is a very interesting thing about these mythological themes. The achievement of the hero is one that he is ready for, and it's really a manifestation of his character. And it's amusing the way in which the landscape and the conditions of the environment match the readiness of the hero. The adventure that he's ready for is the one that he gets.
Look, I ain't in this for your revolution, and I'm not in it for you, Princess. I expect to be well paid.
The mercenary Solo begins as a mercenary and ends up as a hero.
He was a very practical guy, a materialist in his character, at least as he thought of himself, but he was a compassionate human being at the same time and didn't know it. The adventure evoked a quality of his character that he hadn't known he possessed.
I love you.
He thinks he's an egoist, he really isn't. And that's a very lovable kind of human being, I think, and there are lots of them functioning beautifully in the world. They think they're working for themselves, very practical and all, but no, there's something else pushing them.
What did you think about the scene in the bar?
That's my favorite, not only in this piece, but in many, many pieces I've ever seen. Well, where you are is on the edge. You're about to embark into the outlying spaces. And
a real adventure.
A real adventure. This is the jumping off place. And there is where you meet people who've been out there. And they run the machines that go out there, and you haven't been there. It reminds me a little bit in Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, the atmosphere before you start off the adventure. You're in a seaport, and there's old salt seamen who've been on the sea, and that's their world. And these are the space people also.
Got a bad feeling about this.
Trying to brace her with something.
But my favorite scene was when they were in the garbage compactor and the walls were closing in, and I thought that's like the belly of the whale that Joe
That's
Campbell.
what it is. Yeah, that's where they were, down in the belly of the whale.
What's the mythological significance of the belly?
It's the descent into the dark. Jonah in the whale. I mean, that's a standard motif of going into the whale's belly and coming out again.
Why must the hero do that?
The whale represents the personification, you might say, of all that is in the unconscious. In reading these things psychologically, water is the unconscious. The creature in the water would be the dynamism of the unconscious, which is dangerous and powerful and has to be controlled by consciousness. The first stage in the hero adventure, when he starts off on adventure, is leaving the realm of light, which he controls and knows about, and moving toward the threshold. And it's at the threshold that the monster of the abyss comes to meet him. And then there are 2 or 3 results. One, the hero is cut to pieces and descends into the abyss in fragments to be resurrected, or he may kill the dragon power, as Siegfried does when he kills the dragon, but then he tastes the dragon blood. That's say he has to assimilate that power. And when Siegfried has killed the dragon and tasted the blood, he hears the song of nature. He has transcended his humanity, and associated himself with the powers of nature, which are the powers of our life, from which our mind removes us.
Okay, can people hear me?
Yes.
All right. So that's the second segment. Obviously, as I indicated, these are very wide-ranging discussions. I'll just emphasize again, this is a series of discussions, and these are cut and paste. It's very well done, but the discussions are wide-ranging. So there are many, many topics that are touched on here. And I'd invite any and all of you to comment on the topics or the issues that you thought were important.
If anyone has any questions or comments, you can type ! in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. Peter is first.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, yeah, I was so I'm going to talk about what I watched in the video in my own way. This may not sound like a direct, I guess, response to the video, but I think it's quite, I don't know how many people here can attest to this, like from a different culture, meaning non-Western, if you know what I mean. Because there are some cultures, even in today's world, where this notion of hero is actually almost non-existent. Meaning that there are places, so for example, like I believe Soviet Union and also modern China, right? It's because the way the country is structured and the social values, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, I'm just saying the way it is, okay? And the extreme collectivism, if you will, in conjunction, like all these things working together, and also, government censorship about not making certain things such as anime or manga or MCU. Like somebody gotta wonder why MCU was created in the West but not in the East. Why is DC the same way? And I think it has a lot to do with a local culture as well as the government, the way of regulating things. So I think this is quite interesting. I know it's not a direct response to the video, but in case people don't know that, I lived in both worlds, right? One without the notion of hero. Like some people say this is not a big problem. Well, if you think about it from a fictional standpoint, that maybe is true, right? Because some people might think, what's the big deal if there's no Star Wars, let's say, ever? But it can translate to real life in the sense that, and I'm just going to wrap it up by saying this, and I've witnessed this as I live in different countries, which is when someone gets hurt in real life, in a country like that, nobody does anything, right? It's not that they're all cowards. It's not that everyone in that country is evil. It's there's not the notion that I should just be the one that actually help or do something. But on top of that, there's actually no such thing as what we know in the West, or especially the United States. It's called the Good Samaritan law, right? So imagine you do something good and you stand out, but then in a bad way, right? What is the phrase? It goes, when good deeds goes punished, then we will have less good deeds in the world. So that I think that's one of the downsides to be in a culture where the concept of heroism is being suppressed.
That is really interesting. And I think it's, I hadn't really picked up that all these examples are really so far from well, Buddha is different, but from the West. And I think there might be something, it's certain what you're saying is consistent with other comments that Joseph Campbell has made, including later in this video. He talks about how in the West, people have a strong ego, which will try to overcome challenges. So he's talking in a different context, but I think it's consistent with what you're saying. In the West, it's a strong, people have a strong ego, and in the East, they tend to have a, they're culturally, they evolve, or they're raised, developed in such a way that they have a weaker ego. And I think that ties in with what you're saying. That's really, really interesting. Anybody else?
If anyone has any questions or comments, you can type exclamation point in the chat or raise your hand in Zoom. I see Mark has his hand raised. And then Katie.
Hi, I would just try to respond to the last, I think it was Peter, who, in suggesting that China or the Soviet Union doesn't have its heroes, I immediately thought of Mao Zedong and the way in which he was divinized, I guess, and turned into almost a kind of deity. I know that he kind of had a difficult life because he was definitely beaten by his father. All his siblings were beaten by their father. And he did read Western intellectual works like Adam Smith and Montesquieu and things like that. But he also participated in a series of uprisings during a famine, and the leaders of those uprisings were executed. So in a sense, he went through a trial that we might imagine like a hero. And I'm just wondering if there's any, if we can think of him, I mean, not we, but whether he was depicted in China as a hero. That was my question about that. And I have another question about Jonah. Maybe it's more of a comment, but I thought it was very interesting that Campbell in that last segment said that the hero is always prepared for the journey that they are embarking upon. And then later on, when they mentioned being in the belly of the whale and Jonah, I was thinking how Jonah ran away, of course, when God asked him to go to the people of Nineveh. And when the ship was tossed at sea, he said, "Toss me overboard. I'm the cause of this storm." And I guess I was thinking that Jonah himself was not aware that he was ready, although God thought that he was ready, which is probably why God, according to the story, approached Jonah. But Jonah himself didn't yet see that he was ready for this.
If I could just a quick response to Mark in just 15 seconds is that, Mark, I think you are correct that the two leaders of those, countries in the past are seen as heroes by millions of people in these countries, in these two countries. But what I'm saying is among the people, like people like us, right? Like most people here are probably not in Congress or anything like that. So you're layman is what I'm saying. And due to the culture, but as well as the oppressive regime, that the concept, the notion of superhero in itself is actually a threat to the regime.
Well, again, I think that's a really an interesting insight, and one I think it'll come up in other contexts again, one we should keep in mind. Anyone else have comments? Ebony, who's next?
So I'm gonna let Laura go next because she hasn't spoken yet. And then it's gonna be Katie and then William.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to think about how both Stalin and Mao, they kind of emerged as like god figures. And I think it's a little bit different from the hero story. It wasn't like a role model, it was something that was deified and worshipped in these countries. So there's a little bit of a difference there. I'm not entirely sure how to describe what it is, but it's something I'm really interested in. And there's another aspect to that, which is I don't believe there was like any really strong conflicts across Europe until after Stalin's death, and then there was quite a few uprisings. I think it hacked into some part of some part of the brains of people in like Eastern Europe, where through all the suffering they were willing to deal with it while there was like a god figure ruling over them.
Thank you, Laura. Up next, I have Katie, followed by William.
Yeah, I think you could argue that someone like Stalin might be an a-religious Moses, like someone who's trying to lead his people into like a better state. And we still have that today. I mean, that's what Putin thinks he's doing in Ukraine. But my point was going to be that adventure. So I think maybe what I'm struggling with is this word adventure, because I think of a divine figure is omnipotent, and Jesus definitely faces trials, and he still needs to convince his believers, and he asks for water rather than just making water magically appear. But I think that I'm struggling a little bit with the sense of adventure. Maybe that's why I might classify him a little bit more as a savior than a hero.
Well, I think that's certainly valid. There are a lot of different variations on this theme, and Joseph Campbell refers to them sometimes just in passing. I already mentioned, that I think that the personal journey we all go on fits into his mold or his part. We all go through the meta story that he has described as the hero's journey, even if we are not a cultural figure. So we don't necessarily go out and come back with a material or spiritual benefit to our community, but we still are going through that experience. So those are two different variations on that story. Another one is the one that he mentioned just in passing, and that is that sometimes a hero will go out and he'll come back with what he thinks is a benefit and what might actually, could be a benefit, but it's rejected by the community. So I think that I don't know whether he would characterize that person as a hero, as definitely a different variation. So there are a lot of different variations. He talked about the person who goes into the depths to confront the dragon, and sometimes they're cut to pieces, sometimes they kill the dragon. So these are all variations on this motif. The one thing that again, you can't go over all the examples in this video format. I'm not sure he addresses them all even in his writings, but I would ask, is the person who goes in to confront the dragon in the depths and is cut to pieces and is never resurrected, is he also a hero? He or she, are they also heroes? I would say that they are, but the again, it's another variation that isn't really discussed and that we could, think and talk about here. The more broadly, it was on a point that Mark was making, that we're always prepared. The hero is always prepared for the journey. I guess if you're not prepared, you probably won't be recognized as a hero. And it said, someone else said that the adventure, that the journey that the hero is ready for is the one that he gets. I think Joseph Campbell actually said that in the video. There is, however that might happen, there is the hero's capabilities complement the challenge he's presented with, or the challenge that confronts him. And if it's an intentional journey, as Joseph Campbell mentioned as one of the possibilities, then that is, that challenge is an opportunity. And if he seizes the opportunity and he benefits, or others benefit from it, then he would be the hero. If it's an unintentional one, it isn't one that he goes out and has already identified and seeks and pursues, but it's one that it's an opportunity that, or a challenge that presents itself to that person. That would be like Jonah being swallowed by the whale, and he wasn't really planning on that. But he found he was up to the challenge. He met the challenge, and he benefited from it. So there are different ways in which the challenge and the hero encounter each other, but I think that there's some coincidence, and this is again referenced by Joseph in different contexts. There's always, in these successful stories that you would call a hero's journey, there tends to be a successful outcome. And that is where the ego comes in. I'll just flag that because that's going to come up later. And this is my own take on what Joseph Campbell's talking about. If you refuse, the ego is the thing that wants to keep you the way you are, wants to preserve the status quo, keep you the way you are, keep you locked in to the way things are, safe, in a comfortable environment. And if the ego controls, then you will avoid the challenge. You will refuse the adventure. And that is an alternative. That people do that. So the challenge, part of the challenge is in embracing the hero's journey, is overcoming the ego. And part of that is that you realize you are at risk of losing a lot. You may not lose a lot, like your life or whatever. There are risks of loss. And in addition to that, there are inevitable losses, because when you go through this transformation that occurs when you confront the challenge, you will be changed, and giving up on those old ways can be scary. And so some people, this fear that you have about new ways and wanting to hang on to the way you are, that I think is what Joseph Campbell presents as the ego. And it's what really prevents you from engaging in your hero journey, which he thinks is an opportunity available to all of us in life. Because life will impose itself on you, whether you intentionally seek it out or it breaks in on you. Okay, anybody else?
We have William, Mark, and Steve.
No, go ahead.
I'm ready to speak if I'm allowed. Hello.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Bill Lapp. I wondered about this scenario. I mean, the thing about being a hero. Like one time I was in a bar and this woman was being beaten by her husband, and I told him to stop. And he left. But then when I left the bar, there were 25 people outside ready to pummel me. One tripped me up. At first, I got up, and then I had to fight them all. And my friend, who, yeah, well, I will acknowledge she has been a junkie for many years, but she came along, swooped me up, and then they chased me down the street, and then I knocked 5 of them out, and then I walked down the street, ran down the street, that is, to my friend's house. But then in the interim, somebody else came along and sent a very frail person to try to come and save me. And I'm not a frail person, but I had to go back, and then I had to fight him again. So what I really want to know is it non-violent to let yourself or another innocent people be beaten to death or killed? If you can help me. There.
You said, is it non-violent to do that, or is it heroic?
Well, there's some interesting distinction, and I appreciate your distinction. I don't think it's non-violent. I think it is non-violent, because letting somebody be beaten to death or killed when they were innocent people doesn't sound like it's a violent action. I just want to save the woman from being beaten down on a barroom floor by her husband and her his compadres. Now, I don't count myself a hero per se. I'm just saying that that's what happened.
Okay. Maybe I can just say something. Sort of tying this back to what the person was talking about before, about an Eastern traditions of like this idea of a hero being punishable, like in China or Russia, maybe, you know, it's kind of a parallel because these people kind of represent a sort of regime of sorts. Even though you were being a good Samaritan, it wasn't
to jail.
It wasn't rewarded, or you know, even if it had gone into a legal situation, the police, the Justice Department might, you know, might have still penalized you for your participation or whatever. But kind of going back to that other point, you know, I think it's interesting. I think it sounds like something more an American person would do than someone in another country, than in an Asian or Russian country, maybe in this parallel. You know, having this good Samaritan mindset. It's interesting that we supposedly are raised in America to have that kind of thinking. But I still think that there are faults with that as well. Okay, that's my point. Hodgepodging between people.
Well, I don't know what the others are going to say, but I think, to me, I'll just say quickly and then I'll let the others talk. That I think that clearly was a heroic act on your part, as evidenced by Peter when he was talking about the East, the absence of that sort of a Good Samaritan act. The evidence is the fact that it clearly is an heroic act to intervene in that case. And thankfully, you were, it sounds to me like you were successful. Yeah, and thankfully you were successful.
Yeah, I could have been killed easily.
But, and I put that out there because, you know, maybe you don't want to embrace the mantle of hero, but that clearly is a heroic act. What Joseph Campbell's talking about here is the characterization of life of the life that we all go through as heroic. So it's a little bit of a different point, but I don't want to leave you in any doubt that I think what you did is very heroic. Anybody else?
Up next, we have Mark, Steve, and Mark's iPhone. Mark S.
Yes. I was thinking a little bit more about what we were saying about China, and I don't want to distract really from that last comment or change the subject, because I agree with Brian that in many ways that was heroic for you to stand up for that woman. And you were taking a risk. And another person who took a risk was that unnamed person during Tiananmen Square. There are people who stood up to the Chinese government. And
yes,
some of you who remember that 1989 Tiananmen Square uprising, the person who stood up to the tank is not really known. Some people think it might have been a specific person, but he's basically referred to as Tank Man. And I guess this is telling us something about the serendipity. We don't know whether that person planned to go out and stand in front of a tank, or he just found himself there. And he was definitely named as one of the most important people of the 20th century by Time magazine in one of their Unknown Rebels features. That was in 2016. Oh, I don't know when that was actually. So, and we may not even know who this person is, and yet he can still represent a hero for us in some ways. Thanks.
That's an excellent point, because in addition to the material or spiritual benefit that the cultural hero brings, just the story, knowing the story of that person inspires others and encourages others in their own personal development, and if the opportunity presents itself, to obtain other material and spiritual benefits for their communities. So yeah, just that's really interesting. Just the story about an anonymous hero can inspire other heroic acts and other heroes. That's really interesting.
Up next, we have Steve, followed by Mark.
This triggered in me a memory. I don't know, I think many of you are familiar with the kitty, I think her name is Javasi, I'm not sure, in the 60s in New York, where she was stabbed like 18 times and no one did anything. Actually, the assailant came back again and stabbed her another 18 times. And just many people were just onlookers. The good thing about that was, though, that we got the 9/11 call from that incident. So there was something positive that came out of that. My second thought is that the hero has to get to the point of courage. There, has to be a sense of bravery and courage to start the journey. And I don't think anyone would, disagree that the firefighters and that, went into the Twin Towers were, they were heroes. Many of them perished, but they had the courage to go in and do their job and to try to save lives. And the Gilgamesh story, of course, we know from ancient Sumeria, where he returned and he was a failure. So, I mean, heroes often fail, but they transform themselves, their own emotional, psychological, spiritual development is transformed by the journey. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really good. I like that. And that helps me too to identify what's, when do you become the hero? When you accept the challenge and you accept the challenge. That's the key moment, that bravery, that moment of bravery that you talked about.
Up next, we have Mark's iPhone.
All right, sorry about that. To the guy that was in the big fight where he was trying to save a woman. Obviously you survived, but if you want to like compare it to, the question would actually be if it was better to be heroic or to sit in bed. Because what if you had died? Because then you would probably be in a situation similar to Achilles, where when he was alive, he claims, I would rather, die gloriously in battle fighting against the enemy than stay at home. But then in the Odyssey, you get the opposite reaction, where a guy Achilles basically says, I wish I had never gone to war and lived to a ripe old age, having never known it. Where a contradiction, because one is saying it's better to be heroic, and the other is saying that it's not. I don't know. Is there anything anyone wants to comment on that, especially in relation to the other guy's story?
I'll say something and then I'll let Kay go. I think sometimes, I think it's all a matter of perspective. Looking at it hindsight being 2020, you can see things clearer. But I think a hero sees something and has the courage to act. And I think a lot of times, especially with the hero, it's not something that they plan to do. Like William didn't plan to, save a woman that night, but when I hate to say when duty calls, but I can't think of any other way to say it, but when duty calls or when a situation calls, the question is, do you answer? And, acting is bravery, it's courage. Now, to say if it was not talking about William's situation, but to say if the action in general is foolish or not is 2020. But maybe just maybe, if you had thought about it, you probably wouldn't have done it. But sometimes it's just reaction, but it's reacting in the right way. Up next, I have Kay.
Oh, sorry. I'm just turn this down. Sorry.
Kay, did you want to?
Sorry. I'm multitasking here. Thank you. Okay, so what was I going to say? Oh, about the second last person. I didn't catch his name. Yeah, I think that right now, or what I wanted to comment on anyways, today for all of us, I think that we have to become heroes now, or since we're talking about this hero archetype, we just have to. We have to just see what's happening and just become courageous and find others that see things clearly and don't want to bicker and all that and just get things worked out. Whereas in cherished stories, well, writers can answer this, but I just wanted to say that I think that today we do have to be courageous, or we're going to lose our species and our home. Thank you for this opportunity. It's a wonderful meeting, and thank you to the hosts. It's a beautiful story, and the video I hadn't seen before, so thank you very much.
Kay is making the point that Joseph Campbell makes at the very end of this video. And really makes it. She's made it very well, and he also talks about it in very poignant language, that this really is the challenge of our age.
I don't see anything else. And Brian, we are close to time. tonight. We're almost at the end of our 2 hours, so how do you want to proceed?
Well, I'm happy to go ahead. It depends on what the group would like to do.
Well, I personally have to get up early tomorrow morning, so normally I would be like, go ahead on, but unless you want to take over hosting, which I think I can switch you as host, and then all you have to do is end the meeting whenever you're ready.
Okay, can we find out if anybody else wants to continue?
I think Kay is a yes.
Yeah, I'm
Or she
okay.
raised her hand.
DLJ.
I mean, it's only 3 in the morning, so keep going, man.
Yeah. Laura is a yes.
I think yeah, okay, let's just keep going and see. People seem to be generally, the positives, everyone seems to be positive. Yeah, I'm happy to keep going, and apologize to those that can't stay. The topics he touches on in the rest of the video have to do more with the psychological aspects of how the mythologies, the meta stories embedded in mythologies encourage us to bring the mind in accord with the body. That's one of the main themes. And then and then at the end, there's a series of different topics. Where's the place that people want to find? What are in these, where are they trying to get to in their hero quests? That is, and there he ties it in with the spiritual heroes. And then he goes off onto the Gaia principle, which is what Kay was talking about. So yeah, let's go ahead and maybe next time though, I'll plan that we'll have well, we'll see how this goes, and then we'll plan maybe next time to do just half of a video instead of a whole one. Okay, so that means that Evanique is going to disappear. Maybe she has disappeared. Have you disappeared, Evanique? Yeah. All right. So if for any reason we get cut off, we'll just pick up next time where things fall apart. David Millers has to go. Bye, David. All right.
Bye.
All right, let's see. I'm going to share the screen. Oh, here's my wife. 1 second.
Because I tried to talk, but you wouldn't hear me. I mean, you've got fully a half of it, of the video.
Right.
So maybe I would say, maybe we could continue some discussion, but you could.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea.
Then they can discuss for a while now, but not do any more video because there's a half of the.
Right. Okay. So Penny has a good idea. We can continue discussion. But then we'll just the video, let's say the video's wrapped up for this evening, but we'll continue discussion. And then we'll pick up on the second half of the video because this is just about right in the middle of the video. And so we can do the next video next time and plan on it being that second half will take up the full 2 hours. And I'm sure that it would because of based on how the conversation went here and then the topics that are addressed there. So does anybody have further comments on what we've already seen? I'm glad to continue discussing, and I'm sure others.
Are we going to discuss like movies and general amounts of media for like more of the heroic elements?
Well, feel free to discuss what you want. So the broader is fine with me. Whatever
Yeah,
that-
because I do have one that I think some people might find interesting. So, if you don't mind if I take the floor.
Go ahead.
All right, so yeah, I watch a lot of anime, and one of them that was pretty interesting was this idea of a character named Gilgamesh, who is essentially based on the mythical Gilgamesh. But when he's transported to our time, he's essentially an asshole. But the funny thing is that the context, depending on it, can change how you kind of see him. Because once he's back in his own time, he's actually like necessary as in order to achieve the heroic results, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. That ties in with what Joseph Campbell was saying, that, you know, they're different, there's variations on this meta story based on different cultures, but also over time. And the stories are appropriate to the time and to the place and the time. And the fact that this story, that he was successful and the story preserved, suggested that it was an appropriate story, an appropriate behavior, an appropriate character at the time. So Gilgamesh is an interesting story. We could get into that at some point if you'd like. But yeah.
Well, what's funny about him is that he does achieve enlightenment, but he spends actually half of his life pretty much like a tyrant. Like he's kind of he is an evil guy. You kind of think of it. And so, yeah, he's an asshole. But once he gets to a certain age, that's when he achieves enlightenment and he becomes a much more nicer person.
There's a lot to that story. And you said, you go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry, let me open the chat. Okay. Let's hear what Laura has to say.
Yeah, I just have like a general question for everybody, but I've read Eric Newman's work, so he's the guy who worked under Jung for a long time, but I haven't read Campbell's work. So I was wondering if there's a huge difference between what Campbell and Jung thought. Or
I
if
think
there's
that
any like huge conflicts.
because Jung was very big on like archetypes, so is Campbell.
I don't really I don't really know. It's the kind of thing I'll bet I could Google and find something. But I would say that Joseph Campbell's emphasis was more on mythology, and then that certainly was true of his academic career. And then to understand mythology, he embraced psychology. And I think that it's the inverse for Jung, who started out in psychology and found that the discovered archetypes and that dreams are similar to myths, and so got kind of the same point, but to the same place, but in a different way, from a different starting point. So I think in the end, you could probably find differences, but I think there are usually differences in the path that they took and the emphasis that resulted from that. That's my reaction. Does anybody else have anything else?
I can add that I do know that Carl Jung also studied myths cross-culturally. So it wasn't purely through psychoanalysis that he came to his ideas.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think he did absolutely both. And Campbell studied psychology, and Carl Jung, he studied Jung. So yeah, it's definitely true. Like Carl Jung's mother was a Christian that embraced a lot of, from what I've read, Gnostic ideas, and so that's a mythology, if you will, that he was quite familiar with. And there were other mythologies that he investigated and pursued. Yeah, I think that it would be that's a very interesting question. I don't think I'm really competent to answer that. better than I have already. Does anybody else have anything?
I think that Campbell learned a lot from Jung. And I'm pretty sure that at various times he cites Jung's theory of individuation and the steps that we have to go through to recognize the shadow and the anima, animus, etc. So I think they're in a way closely connected, but I can't say specifically on what they may have disagreed about.
Yeah, that's a good one. I hadn't put those two together, but my immediate reaction is that individuation, it has some parallels with the hero journey.
Yeah, the hero journey is something that Jung saw in his work too. And it's partly where he gets his ideas from on individuation.
I think that Jung was definitely he preceded Campbell. So, Campbell was more after World War II, and Jung was after not exclusively, but after World War I, during and after World War I. So maybe there's some significance in that too, that the psychological that Jung presented had already formed and presented, especially in the English world, but also the German-speaking world, was already out there when Campbell was doing his work, and was probably informing mythological studies at the time that Joseph Campbell picked up on those things. So, DLJ.
Yeah, thanks very much for all this. Appreciate the time and effort. Although I didn't realize you were going to go through the videos, because I spent the day watching the whole thing, 5.5 hours of it. I didn't have to, did I? I'm just thinking from a timekeeping point of view, because it's going to be difficult if there's a lot of people with things to say. You might want to do some sort of time notes. So when there's a question answer, and just make a sort of like a timestamp that, and then treat that as one bit. And then there is a bit of repetition in the video, so you might want to say, okay, I can skip the next bit because it's the same as the last bit. And then we don't necessarily have to see the whole video, because we could do that on our own, right? Does that make sense to you?
That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work, DLJ.
Rather than watching the whole thing from beginning to end, you sort of go, right, this is the next bit we want to talk about, and then this is the next bit, and you can control us more.
Well, that's a good idea, because I did look at how to break this up, or how to present it, because it's so different from some of the others that I presented. It's an interview format. It's open-ended questions. The questions are not systematic. It doesn't follow the studies that Joseph Campbell made. So I did look at different ways to break this up. I definitely thought I could identify specific questions, and in some cases I did. For example, a good places to break it up. Let's see, we haven't really gotten through to some of those questions, but assimilating that the myths have to do with assimilating the power of the unconscious into our conscious. So the powers, if you will, of the body that drives the emotions into the intellect, becoming aware, and giving expression to them, embracing them, accepting them, giving expression to them. That's one of the things he talks about next. And that's based on let me look back. But that's not based on a particular question. It's a really important break. It's an important topic, but it's not based on the question. It's based on just pursuing a discussion of Jonah and the whale. Joseph Campbell talks about Jonah and the whale, and then he talks about the significance of Jonah and the whale, which is the story of confronting going into the unconscious, realizing there is danger there. He says then controlling it. I think the better word might be mastering the dangers in the unconscious. But then he starts talking more generally about this dynamic. But none of that's based on a question. But I did decide to break it there because I think it's really useful. I thought it'd be really useful to listen to him talk about this dynamic in general. So yeah, that's the kind of thing I had to kind of puzzle out as I went through this. At the end, there are some questions that are very more specific, and he deals with them in like 3 minutes each. So breaking those up into little segments, I thought wouldn't be that useful. And then the very first questions that I'm going off on this. The very first questions he asked were rather pointed, like, do the stories vary from culture to culture? And he doesn't talk about culture to culture. He talks about over time. And then he talks about Buddha and Jesus and Muhammad and Moses, but doesn't really relate it back to the question. He goes off on spiritual versus physical. And so it's a very, again, I think it's kind of an unstructured.
But in that case, you might just want to book more sessions.
Yeah, exactly. As was indicated tonight. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks again. Very worth watching.
Okay, Kay.
Thank you. Yes, I'm enjoying listening. I was just wondering what the woman who spoke, the third last person who spoke, she spoke about psychology, but I forgot, I didn't catch it. I'm doing other things here, and I'm just using a phone today. I'm not keeping it with me. I'm just leaving it somewhere. So I was just wondering if she could just summarize what she said, please, again.
Let's see. Laura was the one who talked about psychology, and she's still here. Do you want to talk again about that?
If she's willing to, thank you.
Yeah, I can. Mostly I was just saying that I haven't been able, so far with what we're learning, I haven't yet seen any differences between Joseph Campbell's ideas and Carl Jung's. So I was just kind of curious if anybody had been aware of like strong differences. And I also mentioned that Jung studied myth very deeply. So it wasn't just like through analyzing the dreams of his patients or the visions of his schizophrenic patients either. Like he analyzed myths across culturally.
Yes, and I'd have to look back. I've read about this history, but Joseph Campbell was not the first person to study comparative mythology either. And he did study in Germany, and he studied comparative mythology in Germany. And one of his professors is still considered one of the founders of that field. And that field already existed when Carl Jung was out there. There was a lot of development in this kind of intellectual thinking, in academic study and thinking in the second half of the 1800s, the early 1900s. The Upanishads were translated into German. The German universities really were better at this than English or American universities at that point. The German universities were just decimated by the Nazis, but they really had done good work in this area and were leaders in the world. And if you hadn't studied in Germany, you really weren't you weren't first class. You weren't considered up to speed. Joseph Campbell did study, and he studied with some of the founders in the field, as I recall. I'd have to dig back to find it again. But I guess the point of it is that, yeah, Joseph Campbell studied with some of these people, but they were people that precursed, and that these ideas were out there already with at the time of Carl Jung, and they were part of the excitement of the era. Even psychology was a part of the excitement of that era. The things that we take on as kind of, I wouldn't call them canon, but established wisdom, were just being new discoveries at that time, and were so exciting. It's sometimes we lose touch with that. Laura.
Yeah, going off something Mark mentioned in the chat, so maybe this is just a question for Mark. But he said Jung and Campbell have a very different view of human nature. So I was wondering if he could expand on Campbell's view, which was the fusion of both the unconscious and the conscious.
You know, Laura, I don't think I could do that. I was quoting from the Jung Institute, so I can't independently verify that that is actually the case. But I think that one difference between the two thinkers that I am aware of is that Jung, I would say, practiced, I don't want to say mysticism, but maybe it was mysticism, because Jung went into his dreams, and in I think it's called the Red Book, he goes into the mental and spiritual internal journeys that he experienced. And so he was maybe a little bit more of a practitioner than Campbell, who was more of an academic.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Well, I've read one or two biographies on Jung, and he's been described as an introvert. And really, it's wonderful there's a man who went into the wilderness he went into was his own self. I don't want to say just mind, his own self, and brought back tremendous spiritual benefits for mankind through this introversion, and shared it with us and other people. And I think it probably is true that Joseph Campbell did not proceed in that way. He's more of a literature professor. Anybody else? I think Joseph Campbell, though, in the end did, really tried, and I think achieved in his efforts to distill benefits for others out of his studies, more than other academics may have been able to do. And I think that's why his work really still resonates. Let's see if anybody else. Okay.
Yes, thank you again. I know that a lot of men, especially, it seems mostly Europoid men and boys, identify a lot with what you had brought up earlier, the film Star Wars. So if no one else can think of anything they want to talk about that relates to everything that's come up tonight, I think it's always interesting to hear how men identify and what it means to them, what that story means to them, or any of the stories. But I know that definitely Star Wars, and of course the series Star Trek too, it seems to have such a, I think we were speaking a bit about mythology, and I think it has a huge importance in contemporary culture for boys and men. So I'm just bringing that up as something that some people here might want to speak about.
Well, that raises a lot of topics, and a lot of it is, I'm sure, culturally, just as the video or the movie itself is culturally conditioned, our response to it is culturally conditioned, and they're probably mutually reinforcing. In a very, in a very big picture way, Evanique, my wife, and I did a series on goddess worship. And this sort of hero story, one of the first of which was Gilgamesh, is a rather recent occurrence in world history if you compare it to goddess worship. There's pervasive archaeological evidence, convincing archaeological evidence that there was goddess worship, but as far back as 50,000 BC. And this, I think the furthest back you could date this kind of, at least this kind of story, the furthest back would be 5,000 BC. So there was 45,000 years of goddess worship where different characteristics were valued, nurturing, producing, and that all started to change around 5,000 BC with the growth of civilization as we know it. So that's the very big picture. Does anybody else have something else to add? Actually, there was, people think, well, some claim, academics claim, that there's a story. Gilgamesh is an adaptation, and maybe if my wife's still on, she could talk to that, because I think she knows better this evolution. But the Gilgamesh is an adaptation of an earlier myth, and in the earlier myth, he was not present, and the Gilgamesh is a creation myth of how the world and things in the world, natural and cultural, were created. And he's key and central in doing all of that, except for fresh and salty water. And I guess maybe the sky. But there was a previous Sumerian myth where all these things that Gilgamesh created were actually created without any hero involved in the story. It was the goddess who did it all, and then the story was adapted with Gilgamesh. And they're different. I mean, if you want to get into that a bit, it's a lot of the male-dominated mythologies come from present-day Ukraine and the steppes, where people over time evolved into riding horses, went from eating horses to using them as animals, to draft animals to pull wagons. And they needed wagons because in the steppe they moved from place to place a lot. And then chariots, which could be, because if they moved down into the mountains, and then they saw that there were these really nice civilized places in the Euphrates Valley, and there were cities, civilizations, and they had a lot of goodies, and it would just be a lot easier, just like black bears do today. It's a lot easier for the black to go into the city and eat the donuts than to go out and catch a squirrel. So these guys these marauders would come down, sweep down, and plunder, and then go away. And so that the city could recover, and then they'd come and plunder again, because that's how they lived. And it's nice to think, it's kind of romantic to think, yeah, man was closer to nature back then. Yeah, and that's true. And that also meant that people outside of your tribe were considered animals. So killing for these marauders, killing the people in the city was no different than hunting for elk, and a lot easier. So but then, yeah, they finally prevailed. These marauders moved into the city, they took it over. Actually, the war became more prevalent, and political organizations became larger, and these stories evolved to capture that. You have in these older mythologies mostly creations of nature, and then creations of artifacts like pottery and weaving and all that. But then as the stories go on, you get mythologies of the creation of cities and buildings and other institutions of civilization. And those went hand in hand with the development of the male-dominated mythologies. So how does that resonate with me today? I love to blow up Death Stars. Who doesn't love to blow up Death Stars? But when I look at Ukraine or something like that, I always thought the war was not just criminal, it's just it's ridiculous to go out and it's become even more ridiculous, because that's not the way the economies work anymore. You don't control the land, it's control markets. And something that I think the American gift, if you will, maybe still is or could have been, is that economic competition should be the driving force in world history, not conflict, not political and military conflict. You don't need to conquer the territories of your neighbor if you can compete and control, or if you can compete and control their markets. And maybe that's not perfect, but it's better than killing your neighbor and destroying the property. But that makes absolutely no sense. And but also, now that I'm older, I just think it's criminal that these old men are sending these young boys into battle to kill each other. I think that's ridiculous. It's so anachronistic. Anyway, so that's what I think.
What about all the canteen workers and the mechanics who are on the Death Star? Don't you feel guilty? You've just blown them up too.
Well, it's just a story. It's fun. It's like a video game.
Nicely dodged.
Brian?
Yeah?
You mentioned an earlier Sumerian or Babylonian myth. I'm wondering if you're thinking of the Enuma Elish, which is one of the Babylonian creation stories where Tiamat, the mother, the sort of cosmic mother, has to go into battle against her great grandson, Marduk. And I'm leaving out everything that leads up to this great cosmic battle. But in the slaying of Tiamat by Marduk, some have seen a metaphor of the overthrow of matriarchy by patriarchy. And that's one of the places that you can potentially see that.
Yeah, that's great. Yes, that's perfect. And I think that even ties in historically. Yeah, Marduk was the I think the name given to that god by the Babylonians. Marduk was the god of Babylon. And I think he might have had a different name even in Babylon before the Amorites arrived. The Amorites brought their war god, that was Hammurabi, brought his war god Marduk into Babylon. The Penny, can you enlighten us on this bit? Because it's really interesting.
I don't remember all the stories in detail, but clearly that's one of the transition stories in going from the matriarchal or the goddess worshiping societies to the male dominated societies, which were much more warlike. And so the killing of the Tiamat is a clear example of the switch in a society which was a more balanced and and nature oriented to a society where they were really worshiping somebody who was strong, powerful, and was trying to control everybody, which wasn't the case in the earlier societies. And clearly, I think, just to hook it to the Star Wars story, then which I talked about before, I mean, that's a prime example of basically, that kind of a war type hero where, there is actually fighting and trying to control other people and to take, which was one of the, as Brian had said, pointed out, one of the prime differences between the female dominated societies before the goddess ones and the male ones. The female ones were oriented on producing, on making, on providing. And then the male initial ones came in. The warlike ones were just there to take what had already been done, and which was easier. But then that became an accepted way of life, which probably is reflected a lot in our present society. And get back to the idea of where we're in trouble, because instead of trying to live a balanced existence and realize that the earth is not just something that you could just take from willy-nilly without any consequences. They've reached the point where they've taken so much. They've reached a point where it's clear that they've gone beyond, the balance that had existed. We've thrown the balance of the system off. Man as a whole has. So, and it's kind of a direct path, more or less, from taking what you want and going to dominate cities to, once you have the tools and the technology, just grind up the earth and grab all the minerals and grab all the petroleum and just keep grabbing all the stuff, feeling that, that's a valid way to live, is just taking stuff. So.
Penny,
Yeah.
you're wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking.
No, that's all right. But I'm thinking that, probably it's a good time. A lot of people have had to go. It's pretty late in a lot of places. So it might be a good time to sign off now.
Yeah, we've touched on a lot of topics, and we can, we can definitely go into these same topics again on later episodes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian, for leading.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I thought it was great. I really thought that I love Joseph Campbell, and it really, you can see, sparks a lot in people. There was a lot of great discussion.
Yes, much more than I expected, actually.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll pick up with the second half of this first episode next time, and we'll continue with our open discussion.
Thank you, Greatheart. This is wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Look forward to it. Good night.
Good
Night.
night.